So welcome everyone to the session on fear. I called it Fear, the Doorway to Understanding. And it might be a little different talk than what you were expecting on the topic of fear. As I practiced with it over the week, I sort of came to a kind of a different understanding of how it can be part of our path to awakening in a very real sense, rather than something we try to work with to overcome or get rid of. Which is, when you hear something like fear, you think, yeah, I want to get rid of it. It's like it's a very powerful word in so many ways. So I did say I was going to do a series, and we'll have of talks on fear. And we'll have to see how that plays out. I'll ask kind of at the end what your thoughts are on pursuing it. But this talk is going to look at what fear is, including kind of the different types and varying degrees of fear. We'll look at how fear in our practice can really show us the edges of our comfort zone in our practice. And really, that's where stuff happens. When you move beyond your comfort zone, that's where insights occur. When we hit the edge of this comfort zone. Finally, we're going to explore how to practice with the little fears that arise moment to moment. And that's kind of what I came to over the week, is that if I can't practice with the little fears, like the little fear of pain, or the fear of a little discomfort in my body, or and so those kinds of just little basic fears, how am I going to practice with trauma and some big fears? Some of the fears that were emailed to me were pretty large. They're not small, and can take some real practice with the small fears, I think, in order to engage with them. So that's kind of what I came to over the week. And because a lot of the talks I listened to were talking about how to deal with big fears, how to deal with, especially recent ones, how to deal with the fear around COVID-19, the fear of becoming ill, either yourself or your loved ones, or for society in general, the fear, the collective fear that comes out of a sense of social solidarity. So what is the nature of fear, how it arises, and how we can work with it as part of awakening is what we're looking at. Now, fear is a natural response in many ways that helps protect us and our loved ones. But it can also be inappropriate or even debilitating at times. Fear will prep us with, sort of the primal responses of that are often called fight, flight, or freeze. So we can move into those, biological, physiological responses based on a fear that arises, and this protects us. It protects us from danger. But we often experience fear most often in this society when there's not danger. So in many ways, our stress response becomes hyper aroused. I mean, there's no tigers chasing us. And in many ways, we've got this prehistoric response system for, to protect us from physical dangers when there are few. Mostly it's social dangers, fears, some real, many are imagined. So I last week did this, personal slogans thing, and it kind of stuck with me again. So I might do this a little more. I think last week we had you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf, and what we resist persists. In terms of looking at how to relate to difficulties. What came up for me this week was everything is workable. Everything is workable. If some people don't like the word work in the Dharmic circles because it makes it sound like this is work, so maybe I could say everything is playful. You can play with whatever arises, but everything is workable. Another is we can relate to fear and not from it. Relate to fear and not from it. So if you take anger arises, you can relate to the physical sensations of anger, the thoughts that arise with the anger. So you're relating to it as opposed to relating from it and acting out in an angry way. So relating to it rather than from it. And the other is pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Pain is inevitable, and suffering is optional. So the former, so pain, is related to how we understand fear. And the latter is related to the way in which we handle it and relate to it. So that's what I'd like to do today, work through those slogans and look at how we relate to small fears. And you can see from the guided talk that I was relating to a really small fear, and that was this little subtle desire to move when we're sitting. Where does that come from? I mean, we're asked to sit in stillness, like a still body, and this this impetus, this desire to move arises. And as I played with that, worked with that through the week, I started to see that there's a fear underlying it, a fear of discomfort. And I started to see that really fear is the fuel of the egoic mind. And when I say egoic mind, it's the mind that craves, wants things to be different than they are, wants more of the pleasant, less of the unpleasant. Fear is really the fuel that drives that craving of the egoic mind at a very basic level. So as I said, this may not be the talk you expected because it's taking fear down to this very, very basic level. And I started to, even if I was, had moments where the mind was chattering, I would say to myself, what is the fear underlying this chattering? What doesn't want to be faced or felt in this moment? What am I distracting myself from? are trying to accomplish with this chattering. Just mindless chattering, as it occurred a few times. It was like a fear of helplessness was what kind of arose into awareness, a fear of not being in control. So then I could just sit with that. And it allowed the mind to really, and I just posed the question. I didn't try to answer it. I said, pose the question. It took some tries, right? Pose the question, of course, it just sits there. So then the mind wants to, the awareness has got nothing to say. So the mind's going to go, okay, well, I'll answer it then. If awareness doesn't have a solution, I've got a solution here, and the mind will. So you can just kind of notice the mind wanting to, figure it out, and just letting that go, and just letting the question hang out in awareness. And so, this is what arose in that space. So allowing some space for insight or wisdom to arise. So if you're interested, and I'll ask you at the end, the next talks, I could do one on fear in terms of manifesting as a chronically aroused nervous system. The fight or flight being chronically aroused, and many people experience that. People that feel stressed all the time have this chronically aroused, hyper aroused parasympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight or freeze part of the anatomic nervous system. And I'm sounding scientific, but it won't be scientific at all. It'll just be about how we can relate to this stress. Could do a talk on how to relate to traumatic fear, or what I call memory-based fear, because we have fear that we can be conscious of. The little fear to move, of wanting to move to alleviate discomfort, but there can also be fear that is unconscious, that's memory-based, image-based, that comes up when we meditate. When we leave space, repressed memories can surface. I've seen it many times in my teaching and in my personal life. Now, many teachers won't touch trauma when they talk about meditation. I think perhaps because I went through it myself, going through post-traumatic stress, and having worked with soldiers at the stress injury clinic, working with people who have been physically abused, and around using meditation with them, that sexually abused and so forth, that I don't shy away from talking about how meditation can help. I also don't say it's a panacea or an easy fix. A lot of people may need one-on-one talk therapy, so to speak, either in conjunction or first. I had one group where it was a group with homeless people, and everybody had been physically and sexually abused in the group, and half of the group had to leave as the group went on for counseling. And somebody said to me, well, this is kind of a disaster, isn't it? I mean, you've conjured up, all these memories came up, and it's caused all these problems. And I said, well, all these memories were always there. They were just suppressed. And bringing them up to the surface allowed people then to relate to them and move on in their lives. And that's really what happened for the most part. So I could do a talk on that, a talk on fear of death. Talk on fear is never complete without a talk on fear of death. But I mean, that's just an option. It's kind of the root fear. A talk, and I don't know if this resonates with people, but it's kind of where I'm at in my practice more, as a fear as the fear of the death of the egoic mind. As the egoic mind starts to fade and die, it doesn't just fade and die, it goes out kicking and screaming, and some real fears arise that come up actually for me during my sleeping hours. So that's another talk, but again, I don't know if that's, depends where people are at in terms of a talk like that. So today's talk, I better move on to today's, was to give you an idea of the breadth of what you can talk about around fear. It's a very deep topic. Fear is at the root of much of our suffering as individuals and as a society. And you can really see that as you begin to explore and examine fear. Yeah, different types of fear. I've mentioned many of them. Fears related to safety and security, fear of pain, discomfort of the body, which is what we worked with the guided meditation at a very subtle level. Loneliness, fear of abandonment, acceptance, social acceptance, fear of loss of social connection. So that whole kind of social aspect, fear of helplessness or loss of control. Fourth one is what I call memory-based fear or trauma, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, which people may be familiar with. Fear of extinction or death, and finally existential fear or fear of the ego death. The ultimate fear of the ego is its current death. Kind of lets go of fear of death down the road. It's kind of like, I'm dying now. So it's a very real kind of fear that comes up. So those are the different ones. We'll just cover the first few, the small fears, and look at how they arise. When fear arises, often we move to control or withdraw what's happening rather than feel the fear. I mean, this is a theme. Sometimes I feel like I'm a broken record, right? I'm just saying the same thing over and over. Open to your experience. We did that, there's requests for a talk on relating to the hindrances and relating to difficulties. It's the same talk. I could give the same talk and just put in fear, put in it's opening. I mean, there are nuanced differences, so it is a talk worth hearing. But ultimately, it's dealing, allowing, opening to the fear. And I'll talk about how this does get nuanced and perhaps different with fear. Now, just a little contemplation, you could even perhaps close your eyes for it and allow the reflective mind, contemplative mind to arise. Think of something that raises fear in you. Something that raises fear in you. Really zero in on a situation or event that elicits fear in you. Zero right in on that fear. You could ask yourself now, what am I unwilling to feel in this moment? What am I unwilling to feel? You can open your eyes again, come back. So the practice is seeing what we're unwilling to feel and opening to that which we identify as what we're unwilling to feel. Now, we know a few things about fear. We know that unfaced fear is toxic, that when we stuff it down, it wreaks havoc in people's lives. When it's unfaced, not acknowledged, not dealt with in some way, when it just bubbles under the surface, it's unconscious, not faced, it's toxic. We also know that when we're in a fear state, we're cut off from love and wisdom. In fact, we go into a very narrow, small, self-focused, separate sense of separate self when we're in a fear state. And the separate self really lives in the realm of fear. The egoic or the separate small self lives in this realm of protection and control based on fear. As I said, fear is kind of the fuel for this. And when we get lost in fear, there's kind of an arrest of understanding. We can't wake up when we're lost in fear. And fear can turn into unfaced fear. Fear that's not conscious can turn into a physical illness, depression, anxiety, anger. We can lose our connection with joy. We can try to control everything. We can distract ourselves from life to numb ourselves with work, with drugs, whatever it might be. So we can see how fear it can be very debilitating and very toxic in our lives. So how do we work with this fear? And when I reflected on this and how I've worked with people that have worked with extreme fear, trauma, it comes back to being able to relate to the small fears. And then bringing that bringing that skill, really, the skillfulness of that to the bigger fears. So I'll give you an example. I had a fellow, he's probably the first person other than myself that I worked with who had intense fear. It's a social phobia. Couldn't walk into a room with people in it. Couldn't really, and very, very difficult time socializing or talking to people in any way. And walking into a room elicited a panic attack, a room full of people. So we didn't start working with him around, that. I didn't say, just feel into the panic, or just dive into it and open to it. And we worked with the little fear, the fear that arises when there's a little pain in the knee, the fear that arises when the thoughts arise, and so on. What this underlying thing, and he just slowly opened to more and more of his experience, whatever it might be. And it wasn't a huge, it was like 8-9 weeks where he was able to walk into a room full of people. What he did was he walked in, he started to see the body sensations that precede a panic attack. So he knew, he started to, because he was more in tune with his body, he saw the body sensations, and then he backed up. And then he thought, and then he noticed some thoughts that feed the phobia. So he noticed those, and then that started to calm down. And then he moved forward a little more into the room. He just kind of did this back and forth, this gradual opening into the room. And before he knew it, he came back and he was in tears. I was in tears. I mean, he literally walked into a room full of people for the first time that he can remember. And it all started with working with the small fears first. Oh, I've got a quote here from the Dalai Lama. I love some of the quotes that just flow out of his mouth. If you get a chance to read or hear him speak, or you can watch YouTube videos. They just kind of flow out of him. If you have fear, you should examine it. You should examine if there's something you can do about it. If you can, then there's no need to worry about it. If you can't, then there's no need to worry about it. If you have some fear, you should examine it. Examine if there's something you can do. But he's basically saying, a lot of our fears, we can't do anything about them. The small fears. No, there's no need to worry about them. But if there is something you can do about it, do it. Then there's nothing to worry about. So this entire practice that we're engaged in here and I hope you've seen this, is really about opening to our experience. Body sensations, thoughts, emotions, etc. It's really what this practice is all about, opening to the sensory experience, the 6 senses, that contact with the sense doors. Just opening to it. We open, and we see its empty, insubstantial nature. Right? That's what we're seeing when we open. The insights that we start to see it's impermanent. We start to see that it's selfless, and we start to see that we create a lot of the suffering, the optional suffering around the pain. So fear can arise, and we can create, if we resist it, and we can create a lot of optional suffering around it. Our fear is deeply conditioned, and often we identify with it as well. We can identify with our fears. And what's interesting about noticing fear and practicing with fear, as I said, it eventually takes us to outside of our comfort zone. It takes us to our edge. because we're practicing and suddenly we want to do something else, distract ourselves, or move around. It means we're at an edge. So just allowing to be, just being at that edge is a powerful part of this practice. Allowing ourselves to rest at that edge. And looking at fear, fear can be kind of looking at it as kind of a loudspeaker saying, about to grow, about to understand, right? About to have an insight. But if we don't, if we listen to the fear and we back away from these, I'm talking little fears here, we back away, we circumvent that possible growth, understanding or insight. Tremendously important. That's why we're noticing that the simple thing we did in that guided meditation where we notice the intention to move. So the instruction was to sit in stillness. Simple instruction. I should be able to, for 35 minutes, I should be able to sit here in stillness. What happens? Suddenly there's an impetus to move. And there's actually that sometimes movement. And then judgment about the movement and so on. Of course, the mind gets into that as well. It's a whole side story about it. But this impetus to move, you can just sit at that edge and be with that. What's the underlying fear? Where's the impetus, the intention to move? What's underlying it? And being with that. Sounds so simple, but you can see how that can then expand into bigger aspects of fear, bigger fears. So, fear of pain. So we're conditioned to avoid pain, right? I mean, nobody wants pain. We're conditioned to avoid it. This is what's behind these small shifts in our posture. It's the reaction we have to discomfort or the possibility of discomfort. Of course, if you have a huge pain in your knee or your back, and it's, it gets, so say you're at a retreat. If I have a pain in my knee on a retreat, or I'll sit with it for a sitting, and then the next sitting, if it gets worse and it starts building, then I've got a physical problem that, I maybe need to shift and sit in a chair if I'm sitting on the cushion, or get some supports and, support my back, or, be compassionate and act wisely and appropriately. But most of the time, what's happening is there's just these small shifts in our posture there's no sense of physical damage to the body. It's just fear of pain, fear of discomfort, even potential pain. Of course, the mind can get involved too. The little twinge in your knee, right? You notice the intention to move, you let it go. The mind can go, oh my God, if I don't move this knee, I may never walk again. This could be it. This instruction from Steve could be the demise of my athletic life. So the mind starts to catastrophize perhaps around the sitting still, but very unlikely that that's going to happen if you sit still for 35 minutes. I can almost guarantee you that. And we can look at throughout the day what we do. Look at throughout the day. Many of the things we do are to alleviate small discomforts. Small discomforts. We pee to alleviate discomfort. Then we sit, we meditate. There's some discomfort. Oh, next time I'm going to stand and meditate. Oh, there's discomfort here too. Well, maybe I'll lie down and meditate. Even lying down gets uncomfortable. The mind will constantly crave this sense of comfort. Can we just be present with it and be open to it? It's the nature of the body. We continually feel discomfort and we move to alleviate it. Of course, this creates dukkha. So explore this. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't move, but can we be aware of the underlying conditioning or fear that's underlying the impetus to move? That's really what I'm asking you to do, is tune into that underlying intention or impetus to move, to alleviate the discomfort. So it's useful to work with this physical discomfort and pain. It may sound simple, but it's very useful, and it brings us to the edge of our comfort zone, to the edge of our practice. And this is the place we want to be in our practice. We want to be on the edge of our comfort zone when we practice. This is really the place, because the biggest insights come when we practice at the edge. So can we be aware of this? Can we be open to the discomfort, to the fear, and not identify with what's happening? If we do this, we can begin to have an experience of selflessness, a deep experience of selflessness, of not self and not in control. Not in control. Start to sense into the ungovernability of phenomena arising. Things follow their own laws and they're not subject to our will. Pain and fear arise based as long as the conditions are present that cause them to arise. Right? Pain and fear arise as long as the conditions are present that cause them to arise. They follow their own laws, so they're not subject to our will. You can't will it away. You start to see this you're not this not in control aspect of phenomena arising. So this is good practice. It may sound simple, but it's good practice for relating to bigger fears around illness, old age, death, ego death, as well as extinction. So being okay with what is, being with when our mind's caught in fear, allowing it to be just as it is. So we're not caught by it. We're relating to fear rather than from fear. As soon as we're caught by it, we're relating from it rather than to it. The Buddha said in so many different ways that even when the body's afflicted, the mind can remain unafflicted. Even in illness, in aging, the mind can be unafflicted while all that's arising. Henry David Thoreau, a wonderful, another person who the quotable quotes just fly out of off his pen or his mouth or whatever. There is as much comfort in perfect disease as in perfect health. He said that while he was in the process of dying. So rather than pulling back from fear, can we recognize fear and open to it? And we can practice this with the small stuff. Beginning with the changing nature of what is happening in our meditation practice. What's actually present rather than the concept of what's present. So a sensation, feeling a sensation in the back or the knee or wherever it may be, feeling tingling, feeling heat, perhaps feeling some throbbing, some pinching, as opposed to the concept, my back hurts. That's a concept as opposed to the direct physical experience. So that's what we're opening to, is the direct physical experience. And another way, which is another way we've practiced here, is you can rest in awareness itself. Rest in that which is knowing the sensations. Awareness is always there. It's ever present. You can rest in that which is knowing the sensations. And see that the nature of awareness is such that it's not affected by what is known. Awareness isn't affected by the discomfort or the thoughts around the discomfort. It's like a mirror, it just reflects what's there without commentary, interpretation, decision. You can also notice how fear feeds into our desire system. The fear of not having enough. I remember I was on a retreat and I like peas, especially the Insight Meditation Society peas. Back in the day, I don't know if they're still the same. It's been a while since I've been there, but so first day I went up and I got this rather large pile of peas, and then I sat down and I thought, this is a lot of peas, and I had trouble eating them. And second day I went, and again I just love these peas. I took another huge pile of these peas. I did this for 4 days. It's kind of like a just in case mind, just in case I don't, I have the last mouthful of peas and I want more, I better take a huge pile. Kind of a fear of not having enough. It wasn't until I saw the fear underlying it that I could kind of I did it for 4 days, so it took me a while, but a fear of not having enough. So you can see how fear can drive our desire system in so many ways. This craving system. Yeah. In the face of all the evidence, I still had the fear of not having enough. Okay, just some final thoughts on everything is workable. First, we recognize that fear is present. So fear itself can become the object of meditation. So first, you kind of have to recognize fear. That's why I asked the question, what fear is underlying this wanting to move? Or what fear is underlying this chattering mind? Or what fear is underlying this resistance to whatever it might be that's arising? You can, as soon as you recognize the fear, oh, fear is arising. Here is fear. Fear is arising. And once we do that, we're no longer absorbed in the fear. We're no longer identified with it. It's seen objectively as fear arising. So we're not paying attention to what triggered the fear or the story behind the fear. We're simply opening to the fear. We're deliberately shifting our attention away from the subject of the fear towards how it's manifesting in the mind and the body. Okay? Next, we look at the attitude towards it. We look to see if there's any aversion to it. And if we notice aversion, we notice how aversion strengthens it. What we resist persists. Last week's slogan goes with fear too. What we resist persists. That young man I was telling you about, that's what he discovered. He discovered that, the subtle aspects of his phobia his fear would arise, and he would try to get rid of it and resist it, and then it would snowball and get worse, and then he'd run out of the room. So he started to notice when there was any aversion whatsoever, it strengthened it. I remember Joseph Goldstein said in one talk about being totally accepting. He said to himself, so he was resisting, I forget what the fear was, he was kind of resisting some fear that was arising in his life, and it kept strengthening. And it wasn't until these words came to mind and were like words that he felt. If this fear is with me forever, that is okay. That's accepting. So there's no aversion in that statement. If this fear is with me forever, that's okay. So he's totally opening to it. And next we can look at what we can do to decrease the fear. So just because you've accepted it, it doesn't mean you've accepted the conditions that are causing it, right? We talked about this I think some week ago that you can still change the objective conditions. So take the COVID-19. If there's a lot of fear arising around it, we can make that the object of meditation. We can look at our attitude. Is there an attitude of acceptance or of aversion? Then we can look at what's happening in our lives that are feeding it. Are we checking the news, the COVID channel every 10 minutes? Obsessing about the number of cases and, what President Trump is tweeting about it. And, so we can take appropriate precautions, sure. We can educate ourselves about it, about what precautions would be helpful, but we can also notice if we're working ourselves into a frenzy over it. Notice when we're making the situation worse. Notice if we're making the situation worse by using intoxicants and other distractions to take the edge off the fear. think there might be a lot of that going on right now. And I'll just end by saying it's important to also recognize that there's wholesome fear. The Buddha talked about wholesome fear and unwholesome fear. Wholesome fear means you're listening to the signal that trouble is coming, that there's a danger signal, there's an alarm, a call to action. So we need to recognize when there's a very real danger that you're having a danger signal is eliciting. Yeah. I'll end it there. Didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I'll open it to any questions or comments.
Thanks for the notion of little fears. It was like I really hadn't thought about the degrees of fear. I sort of kind of placed them all in one. I guess I take it for granted is that they're all like at one level, and usually kind of I rank them all at like 10 or 11, on the volume knob. And when you're talking like death and versus, I mean, I'm just thinking about the ones I sent into you, and reflecting on those too. Yeah, some of those were little fears, some of those were medium fears, and I could see other ones being higher on the scale, and that's probably a really good thing to be aware of when looking at fear.
Something that you said really resonated with me. Well, maybe you didn't say it, but it occurred to me. I'm not sure which now, but um, that that fear can be conditioned. It can become a reflex. It can become an unskillful way of reacting, and then it becomes a pattern, and then it becomes unconscious. A reflex as a way of reacting to things, small fears and big fears. So I think what your talk tonight kind of had me reflecting on or opening to is the fact that I need to bring more skillfulness, more awareness to, well, even just the desire to move. I wouldn't have thought that as a fear, but it's, it's looking at it in a new way. And I'm looking at my behavior in a new way. A lot of behavior, my behavior is triggered by aversion or fear. And so that's super helpful. And like you said, you didn't think the talk was probably going to take the form it did, but it's sometimes coming at these problems. They're pretty abstract and pretty basic at the same time. So anyway, some rambling. Thank you.
I'm probably going to be rambling a bit here. I'm trying to get my thoughts collected. I found everything fascinating about this topic this evening, and the focusing on the intention or impulse to move. First thing that came to mind was that discussion we had about free will with thoughts arising. So just watching where the impulses are coming, and they just sort of arise. And sometimes I catch them when I just started to move a little bit and go back. And that feels like it's coming from somewhere else and just arising. But then in response to that, and first, in terms of the fears, and I hadn't really thought about fears in this context before, but there's a layer of fear of discomfort, And then I was thinking, there's also a layer of fear of failure. I mean, I've set an objective to stay still, and so that's failure. I'm not doing as well as I should have. And then even, I'm on Zoom and people are watching me, and if I move, then people are going to see that and they're going to think, well, you can't stay still for that period of time. So there's fears on a lot of levels that arise. And then in terms of the reaction to it, I sort of felt I could make a conscious effort to not move. And then I was wondering, even on the free will side, that feels like something I'm doing now. There's that effort that's being applied to stop myself from moving. But then I became aware that's taking a lot of energy. And I probably do respond to a lot of fears with that kind of response, which is an attempt to control. And there's all that energy. And you had talked about sort of opening to fears and that kind of thing. And then I realized I was playing with it a bit. There wasn't a lot of time. But if instead of the just attempt to control, I applied sort of a playful curiosity to it, I also didn't move, but I didn't feel like I was using effort in the same way either. So there was some interesting things going on there. Anyways, lots of things to reflect on. Great topic from my point of view.
It was really funny because I was half drowsing through half of that meditation, and I could not stop moving because my head was nodding and I was trying not to snore. And yet at the same time, I could feel my fear of judgment of anybody watching me moving constantly, and while half asleep. And I was trying to apply right effort to keep myself awake, but frankly, it was too amusing to watch this interplay between sleep and the fear of judgment. And I mean, that's got to be one of the more, dare I use the word, fun meditations that I've had in a long time, which is really kind of funny on a topic of fear. I also wanted to say that I'd be really interested in hearing about the fear of egoic death. That was the future topic that you mentioned that sounded the most interesting to me. So thank you.
That word, curiosity, is such a good word. And that's really what we're doing with this practice, is bringing curiosity to what's arising, to the reactions to what's arising, to how we handle what's arising, to the thoughts around we're just bringing curiosity to it all. And the way you've described, the different fears that came up beyond what I was, offering in the meditation is so typical of these minds. The judging and the fear of, because we're all in these little boxes and people must be peeking to see if other people are moving. And so there's a story around that. And this fear of acceptance, such a strong one for so many of us, is fear of not being lovable, fear of not being accepted, of disconnection, of fear of loneliness, especially as we age. Very, very powerful fears. And can we bring curiosity to those as well? And it sounds like you did, because the way you talked about it, it was playful. It's workable. You can bring curiosity to these kinds of fears as they arise. It doesn't become such a scary thing. They're selflessly arising. Maybe we'll just watch the show. And really, it's, as I said, it's the fear is the fuel for the egoic mind. It's fuel for the craving mind, craving both sides of it, grasping and pushing away. It's the fuel for all that, based on fears. So sometimes at a very subtle level. So yeah, opening up to the whole range, but I think starting with the smaller ones, I guess, as I said, gives us some skillfulness in approaching the bigger ones. It's been hard not to chuckle to myself. I think that's Terry. It's kind of blacked out, and then it says, witness protection program.
I have terrible lighting here, and I realized that it's just a black silhouette. So I thought rather than fear it, I'll have fun with it.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll say one thing that was on my mind. 25 years ago, I worked in a rehab center for injured workers, people that have been injured on the job, and they went through physical rehab. And I worked in the psych department after just getting out of university. And part of my job in the psych department was to do this relaxation therapy with people, where they'd sit down and listen to this pre-recorded half-hour thing that was like a body scan meditation. And they'd just get really comfortable to get through the chronic pain that a lot of them had. And I was really curious and wanted to learn. And one of the psychologists let me work with one of the patients on something called systematic desensitization. This guy had been through a horrible accident where he was a welder, and he was welding one of those massive propane tanks that you see in the side of stores in rural Ontario and this sort of thing. He was welding inside of there, but there was still propane fume in there. It hadn't been properly ventilated, and it blew up. And so he had this horrible, like you said, like the guy that was going into the room, he would just start shaking uncontrollably and crying and freaking out every time you'd mention propane. And what we would do is we would go through this process of just imagining being in a room where in the next room you could see a Canadian Tire magazine open to the barbecue section. And then he would go through a full body scan relaxation thing. And slowly we'd go from this very small fear into bigger and bigger ones while relaxing the body. And it just brought me back to something I hadn't heard in 25 years. And it was super effective with this guy. He got back to the point where he could go back to work and start working on propane tanks as a welder again. And I think that the advice that you gave us tonight is brilliant. I hadn't thought of that, working with the really tiny fears, but I can see where it really would work.
Well, that last statement really helped me deal with my fear of not being brilliant. Which we all have, right? Yeah, the fear of not being smart enough.
One of the things I've found with addressing fear, and it doesn't, I mean, hasn't happened that all that often, is that is being with it. And I think one of the things that you bring up quite often is the, watching how things arise and then dissipate, right? And I mean, for me, the exercise of looking at fear and my own fear is to try to, I guess, to try to alleviate myself of it in some ways. I mean, in the moment. And I think that one of the I mean, this kind of practice to me would be helpful in being with it, and then having that experience, that knowing that it doesn't stay. It can go, and the fact that it can go away is comforting, and it doesn't, it's not something that would be kind of that has to be chronic. I mean, I guess the chronic part would be the clinging to it, or the aversion from it. It's that sort of Buddhist psychology around, the fear and the method of sort of understanding it, the nature of fear.
Yeah, impermanence is awesome. Can you imagine what living would be like if anything could be permanent?
Hmm.
Like fear? I mean, we wish that, chocolate cake was permanent, or, the feeling of calm or joy or happiness was permanent, but you can't have that and not the other side of it, the 10,000 sorrows, of which I guess fear would be considered one. So yeah, impermanence is great, and seeing that everything is impermanent allows us to rest in sort of what is in the moment, knowing that it's workable. It won't remain the same in the next moment. That much you can say for sure.
Mhm.
Stephen, one thing you and I think others have talked about a little bit is the importance of starting sort of little, and then when it sort of maybe gets a little more intense, then you can sort of back off and keep coming back and forth. And one suggestion I'd received in the past that I found helpful, that I thought I'd just share, if a feeling of fear is too intense, it's normally held in a certain place in the body. And I think for a lot of people, it's held somewhere in the core, like it might be in the gut, it might be in the chest. And the suggestion I got was, maybe at that point, if you're feeling maybe you're being a bit overwhelmed by a fear you're sort of moving into, is take your focus to your feet. And maybe just feeling, your feet on the floor, because we don't normally, at least most people I don't think, feel fear much in their feet. So it sort of takes the focus away and allows that sort of movement away from the intensity, and allows one to move back and forth. I found that for myself to be a very useful technique, so thought I'd share it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's it's also just feeling gravity, which is similar. Feeling your feet, the buttocks touching the chair, the feeling, the support of the earth, sensing into the gravity, and just the body settling into gravity. Is another way of looking at that in a kind of a similar a similar way. But yeah, drawing our attention away from our mind and perhaps our heart space. So I will end it there. I'd be open